Thank you. We must begin rapidly a shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, militarism are incapable of being conquered. These are the words of Black historian and activist Vincent Harding as they were delivered by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1967. That's right. Despite sounding immediately relevant, they were not written for today. April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before Reverend King's assassination. A year ago, on the occasion of Memorial Day weekend, Reverend Abi Janamanchi, self-described UU Hindu and senior minister at Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist in Bethesda, Maryland, noted that in the 50 years that have passed since that speech, quote, the conditions have worsened. And he goes on, racial bias and structural racism continue to kill and stunt the lives of people of color. Income differences between the wealthy and everyone else have widened. Military spending today, adjusted for inflation, is higher now than at the height of the Vietnam War, end quote. 1967 was also the year that Reverend King began to organize the Poor People's Campaign, a social movement to shift our country away from racism, materialism, and militarism. At that time, there was little awareness of environmental issues. When the Poor People's Campaign was reinvented in 2017, ecological devastation was added to the contemporary moral agenda. They state in part, scientists have known for decades that human activities, particularly the use of fossil fuels such as coal and oil and gas, are warming our planet. The truth is that our policies have not fundamentally valued human life or the ecological systems in which we live, end quote. So the sum of that rapid shift called for 50 years ago is that it has occurred, but in reverse. The evidence is there that in our racism, materialism, militarism, and ecological devastation, we have not become a person-oriented society, but more entrenched in things. Harding and King offered us a prophetic warning. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs to uplift socially is approaching spiritual death. It's approaching spiritual death. And that was the warning in 1967. But in truth, that's what it feels like, right? It feels like the spirit of our nation, of our society, within our culture has died. How else do you engage the evidence? Don't you feel deeply damaged or demoralized or having a feeling of dread or even despair? Because I do. I do. And according to the Center of Disease Control, many others do also. They have noted a pattern of what they call deaths of despair. That's an actual title of a CDC report about our nation today. That there is a shortening of life expectancy of Americans, something we've not seen since World War I. And it's due to despair. The editorial, America is losing ground to death and despair, in the Washington Post last November, it came to this conclusion: there is absolutely no excuse for these dark corners of death and despair to exist in a nation as developed and wealthy as the United States. I think they're missing the point. Because if we are doing so well, why is this happening? Why do so many die of preventable despair when we have the most developed machines and computers, the greatest profit motives, margins, and property rights? Why? As I've sat down and talked with more and more individuals from across a variety of backgrounds, they tell me they are feeling damaged, demoralized, dreading what is to come, despairing of our world, debilitated in their daily activities. Every day becomes a struggle. And I find myself recognizing this within and somehow feeling that this is normal. Despite it being terrifying and excruciating to be alive right now, these seem to be the appropriate responses of aware and engaged, compassionate, caring individuals. This is how you respond to a thing-oriented society that is out of our control. But I still wonder why. Not why is it happening, but why do these responses seem appropriate? And why does it feel like a spiritual demise? Now, you might recall, and it's okay if you don't remember the last time I was here, but if you think back from my sermon last month, you might remember that my answer to the question why is relationship. It doesn't matter what you are asking why about. When I ask that question why, I'm not just seeking information, an understanding of why is the world as it is, but I am seeking to understand my relationship with it. So why do I feel deep despair? Why do I feel this way? And the answer then is relationship. I'm a person, an individual in sacred relationship with others in our society and with our world. Or to put it more clearly, I am sacred relationship. I am soul. A thing-oriented society. It exists. It's real. But it rends relationships, and it breaks the soul. Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher from the last century, explored these very same relationships. He understood our I-it relationships as those that keep things distinct. It understands the world as separation. I am, it is, and everything becomes an individual object. But Heath believed that the world wasn't filled with objects, the world was filled with relationships. And this he called I-thou. See, the world wasn't a bunch of individual things to him and his faith tradition. It was one big relationship. And the language sounds like it's two separate things still, but that's just a problem with language. I-thou talks about the relationship between you and something else, everything else. And the ultimate expression of that within his tradition was God. God was the relationship. This is to say that there is a sacred relationship of unity without any separation or distinction. And the wisdom of it, turns out it's echoed through the world's faith traditions. A pinnacle of Hinduism is the teaching that Brahman is Atman, Atman is Brahman. That Brahman, which is understood both as the divine, as God, and as the existence of everything that is, Brahman then is the same thing as Atman. And Atman is understood as the individual soul. Everything is soul. Soul is everything. Instead of being separate or distinct, the spiritual teaching is that everything that is and you are one. One in relationship. Vietnamese Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh, he speaks of interbeing as the sacred relationship of all things. And it's even reflected in our scientific understanding that the universe is a singularity. There is nothing that exists outside of it, so everything inside of it is connected. It's unified. Our individual consciousness is billions of years of evolution resulting so that the universe can reflect back on its own relationship to itself. And all of that, I believe, is talking about soul. I know that's very different from the teaching about soul in other religious settings. The soul that I am preaching is embodied, embedded, and emboldened by my life. This is very different from what I learned each week in the Methodist Church, Christ Church United Methodist, right here in Tucson, where I learned that the soul was an immaterial gift from God that I tended to with my actions in this life. It was most important after I died, because it was how I tended it was judged at that time, and I would either be punished or rewarded on how good I did. Now, I will be fair. That's probably not the doctrine that they were teaching or the theology that they wanted me to walk away with, but that's what I took. But today I believe something else. I believe that we are born into soul. That we exist within sacred relationships, and within them we are nurtured and grow. And so that when we come to ask why, we do so because we yearn to know and to grow more into that soul sacred relationship that we're already nestled in. And yet, I have to say, somehow that's not what we are learning. Instead of I, thou, we learn and we perpetuate racism. Instead of Brahman is Atman, Atman is Brahman, we materialize our world into resources and commodities, and then we use them up. Instead of interbeing, we war. Rather than reflect on our wholeness with the universe, we devastate our own planet. What we are learning is not at all what I think the lessons are supposed to be. And what we are learning is tearing our relationships apart and our soul asunder. I believe that soul is our inherent worth and dignity as interdependent relationship. That our first and our seventh principle of our covenant, the covenant of my church with your church, and our churches with all the others in our association, say the same thing. We are truly inherent and worthy through our relationship of interdependence. And so it is that the other lessons of racism and materialism and militarism and ecological devastation, the lessons that we are living, yes, they are killing us. First, spiritually. as we were warned over 50 years ago, and now physically. In the anti-war speech beyond Vietnam back in '67, Harding and King extended a call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts up neighborly concern beyond one's tribe or race or class or nation in a reality and a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all. It's a call to live in soul, to live within our embodied and deeply emboldened and embedded relationships. For as we ignore them, we tear them. We destroy not only our spiritual lives, but each other. And so a shift of viewing ourselves as soul, not as before and after our life, but here and now. It must happen. It must happen so that we understand the connections and the dependency that we have too long ignored. And it must happen far more than that rapid shift that was called for in '67. And perhaps because of how far we have gone, it must be more than just person-oriented. It needs to be immediate and transformational. Focused on soul, oriented on the deep relationships we thrive within, that we hold with every other living thing on our planet. You see, we need a holy now. Not a holy tomorrow or a holy yesterday, a holy now. This is a shift away from a hand-me-down earth. It's a moving away from legacies we do not want, we could have never wished for, and yet we perpetuate unless we make that holy now. It is to live in inherent holiness and interdependent relationship. It is a soul-oriented society that honors our most sacred relationships, from what we ate for breakfast this morning to what generations past and generations future rely upon us to accomplish now. To live in a unity. And that's the heart of making a miracle that's a promise and a potential that we so desperately need today. Not just to save ourselves or others, not just to save our earth, but to save our souls. Amen.